Today we're going to review this. It's the Z1 grinder from a company called Zerno. And yes, I'm going to call it the Z1 the whole time, even though this company is US based. Deal with it. Doing reviews about grinders is really tricky because you have to ask, why pick this grinder to review? There's so many grinders. How do you choose the one thing you're going to show? The temptation might be pick the expensive thing, the fancy thing, the thing that, might get people a little frothy and excited. But actually, that's not really what we're interested in doing here. I'm not interested in showing you an expensive thing that you maybe can't afford to make you feel bad about not being able to afford or have this thing and therefore question whether your own coffee is as good as it could be and dread, pain. That's not the goal. There has to be something interesting about the grinder that is relevant to your grinder wherever it may be. And in this case, I think there is something about this grinder that is super interesting that feeds into what I will call a grand universal theory of coffee grinding. Before we get to the grand universal theory of coffee grinding, it needs an acronym or something. Comments down below if you have good ideas for it. Well, I want to talk through the review of the grinder because it still seems sensible to do that. This is interesting in a bunch of ways, and I'll talk through a bunch of things about this grinder that I like and a bunch of things that I don't like as much. We'll talk about the theory of grinding, and then we'll talk about who's this for and how does it stack up to some of its competition. The additional pain in reviewing a grinder these days is the fact that burrs have become a thing, frankly. Now, going all the way back to my review of the niche, if you bought a niche, your grinds coming out of that grinder were probably comparable, if we had the same coffee, to my grinds. With the same grinder, same motor, same burr set. That's not necessarily true anymore. When you buy this grinder, for example, you can choose from a variety of burr sets to put in it. So if I tell you how the coffee tastes, am I talking about the grinder or the burr set? How do you assess a grinder without just simply talking about the grinds coming out of it, which are the function of the discs that you've put into this thing? And this grinder in particular feels like it's a platform. It's built to have burrs switch in and switch out. That's the whole point. So how do we talk about the grinder itself? I'll do my best, and that will be most of the focus here. And actually, the grand universal theory of grinding, when it comes to this grinder, isn't to do with the burrs. Well, it is, obviously, but it isn't. Let's get into some of the things that I really like about this grinder. First things first, the look and feel of this thing is great. It feels incredibly solidly built, very pleasingly built. I think it looks beautiful. It has a strong design full of character. It doesn't look like every other grinder that's trying to look like every other grinder. So I like a lot about how it's built. The minimalism of it is charming too. There is an on-off switch. There's no variable RPM, nothing like that on this one. You've got a switch and you've got a grind dial at the front. I will say, as a quick additional note, the grind dial has microns on it. I'm not going to get into this too much, but if you set a grinder like this to 400 microns, that's the burr gap. That doesn't mean the grounds coming out of it will be 400 microns. They'll be close, but they will not be exactly 400 microns. You're controlling a gap between the burrs, not the particles coming through that gap. I like this because it feels just much more user-friendly as a piece of information than numbers. We've always used numbers historically. It's been 0 to 9, and finer equals smaller numbers, and that was it. And you couldn't really say, well, mine's at a 2, yours is at a 5, but are they the same or not? Nothing made any sense. A world where there's a 0 point and then there's microns from there, I like that world. I kind of want to live in that world from now on. Going back to the look, you'll see there's some nice wood accents on this thing. They're very easy to change. You can buy different ones. This has just got a little magnet on it, sits in the front. Obviously, you could change the funnel lid if you wished to as well. The magnet's actually in the catch cup, which is interesting as well. If you ever try and get a spoonful of grounds out of here, that's actually quite annoying because your spoon will stick to the bottom of the cup. From a design perspective, I think they've done a tremendously good job. Look, feel, superb. Secondly, as I said, this is kind of thought of as a platform for different burr sets, and getting into the burrs, changing the burrs is relatively easy to do. Now let me get my Zerno Pelican case. It is an optional extra, doesn't come as standard. In here there's a variety of things, including more burrs, other little tools, Zerno branded of course. Take out 2 screws on the front. Here we are. These burrs that come as standard are what's called blind burrs. There's no holes for screws here. They're held sort of in place magnetically. It does come with a nice little extra, which is these things here. These are little magnets. If we loosen some screws around the edges here, then we can use the magnet to take off our burr. Look at that. Magnets. How do they work? Now, if you look on the back here, This is another likable thing about this grinder. You'll see there are little points where screws would usually be. These can be changed, these little mounting points here, and removed, and then you can use normal screws to screw in burrs that do have screw holes. So you don't have to use blind burrs on this. As a small aside, can't resist it, I'm sorry. It fascinates me that most people are using some sort of burrs that have screw holes in them. They're obviously not clean, these weird holes full of screws. How is that impacting the grind quality? Well, it turns out not that much, but at the same time, people will freak out if they get like a little tiny chip on one part, but like a large cutting section of a burr. That's probably not making much difference either, to be honest. Obviously, if you mess with the cutting teeth, the finishing teeth at the end, sort of where the coffee's leaving from, that's maybe a concern, but yeah, stuff down here, I don't worry about that too much. These burrs are, I think, the high uniformity burrs or the multi-purpose burrs. I think the high uniformity burrs, because they're suitable for espresso. Annoyingly, you've got burr names like unimodal. Obviously, that's a single peak in your grind profile. That's the ideal. So like low fines, good for filter coffee, not good for espresso. You've got your high uniformity, bit better for espresso. And then you've got your multi-purpose, I guess for multi-purposes. I don't find burr naming good or enjoyable. I don't think it's particularly intuitive. They should just have names like Jeremy or something. I don't know. Let's put these in. Well, let's give it a little clean, actually, with my Zerno branded brush. Because while we're here, we're cleaning. Got to clean, you know what I mean? I'll find that in a minute. While this is open, we should obviously talk about the one other thing about this grinder that's kind of interesting and unique, which is this piece here. You could call it a couple of different things. You could call it an auger. Typically, augers are kind of corkscrew systems for moving stuff along. So I guess to some extent, this does move beans kind of from the hopper or the funnel back here into the burrs. But they also play a role in kind of pre-breaking the beans before they get to the burr set as well. So you could call them pre-breakers as well. What's interesting about this grinder is that you can change this part, right? So this is called the slow auger. This is the fast, which I don't believe they sell anymore. And this is the medium. We'll talk more about these. It's relatively easy to change them. There's just sort of 3 screw holes in the back of these. And so you'd unscrew from the back here, change the part, and then you have a whole other auger system in place. How and why does that matter? That's the great question. Imprint this on your memory, or don't be surprised when we cut back to it later. It is just worth noting that what you have here in a very nice body is the ability to use very good burrs and to produce a very high quality of coffee grounds, right? In terms of particle size, distribution, all of those things, this grinds coffee very nicely. Now, in terms of performance, there's a few different things we can talk about. Obviously, grind speed is one aspect of this. This is not a particularly fast grinder. That's also a function of the augers going into it. But I will say now, the augers being fast, medium, slow does not have a dramatic impact actually on the total grind time, especially things like espresso grind settings. The burr gap is going to be what defines the speed of grinding much more than the augers feeding it in. The thing that we often test with grinders is retention. That's a big concern for a lot of people. How much coffee is retained inside the burr chamber around there that doesn't come out completely? You can do a couple things. You can obviously put 18 grams in a bowl, pour it in, weigh the output of that. And that to some extent will give you an idea of roughly how its retention is. And I think its retention is pretty good. You pretty much will get out what you put in. There'll be some small variances, 0.1, 0.2 of a gram, not enough to ruin your day, but small variances. More interesting than that retention test, to me though, is a different sort of retention test, because what's also happening is there's going to be some exchange, right? You will have a little bit of ground coffee in here that when you grind fresh beans is pushed out, leaving behind some fresh ground coffee stuck in the chamber. So you kind of exchanged an amount of coffee in here. When we cleaned that out, you could see there was a decent amount actually of kind of retained coffee, not zero. Every grinder has some retained coffee, so this isn't a massive complaint. The testing that we do, we dial in a coffee for espresso under a fixed recipe. And then we set the grinder much coarser and grind some coffee through, and then return to the original espresso grind setting. That means that any of the retained coffee that will be exchanged should be much coarser than the pieces for the espresso. And you can sort of understand the impact of how much coffee is retained on the next espresso that you brew. And so if this retained a lot of coarse pieces, when I returned to my correct grind setting, my next shot should run fast and be slightly less extracted. What we saw actually was a variance in performance across different burr sets, which was kind of surprising to me. Most of the burr sets that came with this performed very well. I have no real complaints. The next shot after grinding very coarsely when returned to the correct setting was very good, tasted good, good extractions, expected kind of brew times and ratios. As part of this, we had some random burrs lying around that I bought. They're the kind of SSP knockoffs from AliExpress. Don't buy them, because I'm not really pro knockoff, but I was curious what you got for your money. They performed much worse on the retention test, which I don't really understand. They were much less predictable in terms of that first espresso out, and I kind of then returned to baseline. I guess burrs play a role in retention. I can't explain it any other way. I've always thought of this as a grinder first thing, but I don't think I've done this testing with the same grinder across that many different burrs before to sort of see that pop up as an anomaly. But overall, I would say the retention on this is pretty minimal and not really of a huge concern. Of course, you'll want to hear how it sounds as it grinds, and so what we'll do, we'll start with some espresso actually. Let's go to about 125 microns on the dial. On an empty. You'll notice there's no bellows system on this one. You can obviously remove the sort of chute here, but there isn't a normal system to sort of help evacuate the last of the grounds, which I can't really complain about because I've always complained about bellows. It is what it is. I don't think it's a massive issue. I do hate bellows. Let me get my portafilter. It is a sort of a standard, the classic sort of 58mm catch cup that was pioneered, I think, by Niche, and now it's pretty normal, as it should be, because it's just a nice way to live your life. Classic. 18 in, 42, 43 out. How does it taste? It tastes very nice. Of course it tastes very nice. It's a nice set of burrs. There's nice coffee. It's a nice espresso machine. There's nice water. You might say, how do the augers impact the taste of the coffee? It's a good question, that, isn't it? Now, before we brew some filter coffee, which of course we're going to do, I do want to talk through some of my critiques, I suppose, of this grinder, or areas in which I hope to see them improve and upgrade and develop in the future. This funnel, I was going to complain about this funnel. I was going to say the funnel's a little bit small, and I would like it to be a little bit bigger. Not much bigger, because obviously the catch cup capacity needs to match the funnel capacity, but it would just be nice if it was a touch bigger. And then, before I could even film the video, like 2 days ago, there's an email update from Zerno saying, hey, we've updated the funnel. There's now a bigger, kind of wider, better funnel. And I think that's good as a sort of active upgrade path. Things should be retrofittable. I think that's always important, especially when you've got a small community like this one. Like, this is not a hugely popular grinder because they can't make enough to meet demands. So I think that part of it is good to see these kind of updates happening. One of my sort of bigger complaints on this thing is actually an upgraded part. This is the second chute I've had from them. They improved the sort of fit, finish, and construction of the chute. I just don't really like it. You'll see there's magnets here. That's how it holds it in place. It doesn't really do much to mitigate sort of mess. If you don't spray the beans, you do get a decent amount of static here. But if you spray too much, you can have issues with stuff like beans not feeding in properly or clogging in the burr set. And so I kind of want to lean on the side of a little bit less spraying than more. It is worth doing for the sort of reduction in mess. And at that level, I don't have issues, but I wouldn't be heavy-handed at all with water with this grinder. And because it's magnetic, where's that? There we go. I've got a bigger concern, actually, which is I can knock that off with my hand. I could be absent-minded, and then what I've actually done is expose a part of the grinder where angry spinning metal pieces are, right? Like, that's not good. This will run without the funnel on there, and so it's easy to run this grinder with the burrs exposed. If you get your fingers anywhere near this point, blood and probably, A&E or ER, wherever you are. I just think that it can be detachable, that's fine. I would rather it had a kind of twist and lock so it cannot be knocked out by mistake. Magnets are always nice, but I feel like there's just a health and safety risk in having the burrs exposed like this in a grinder like this, just by being a little bit clumsy. Other grinders will have sort of requirements that there are micro switches in them so that they can't run when burr chambers are open or exposed or those kind of things because of this potential issue. So it just is one to flag. I don't think that's a great piece of design from a potential customer finger longevity point of view. Again, you can run the grinder with the funnel out as well. You can sort of see the auger spin. You're less likely to hurt yourself, but obviously don't put your finger in there. You will occasionally get beans kind of trapped in the augury system. Sometimes depends on the auger that you're using. And then once in a blue moon, when I've been grinding very fine, might be a strange coffee or might be a strange brew ratio, but I've been at sort of finer than normal for espresso. I've had a clog happen in the exit chute essentially, and ground coffee kind of back up here. Going coarse kind of purges everything out, but it is a lost, wasted dose. I can't force it to happen. So it's a sort of a freak occurrence, but it has happened a couple of times over the course of testing, and it seemed worth noting. And then the last bit is about the pricing. Now, the pricing is not opaque. They're very clear on what everything costs, but it's kind of hard to talk about what this grinder costs. Just as the grinder without burrs or accents or anything else is $1,265 US. But you're unlikely to spend $1,265 US because you're going to put burrs in it and accents in it, and maybe you want more burrs, and then you can go all the way up to spending nearly $2,900 on this grinder, which is with all the burrs and the augers and all of the fun things like that. So part of me is like, it's kind of hard to talk about what this costs. And if you can't really talk about what it costs, it's hard then to talk about, is it worth the money? It's a nice thing to own. Like it's nice to have a boutique, small run made, very nice thing, great tolerances, build, quality, all of those things. It's just hard to tell you what it costs. If someone's like, hey, how much is that grinder? You're like, well, starting at $1,265. And you know what I mean? I find that a strangeness. This has been a sort of more upgradable grinder than almost anything else I've used. What we'll do at some point is we'll put on screen our full kind of build list and the costs of everything that we have in our total kit here. We've got 3 sets of burrs. We've got 3 augers, even though they now only sell 2. You know, it's a lot. I want to talk now about the auger system in here, which means I now need to talk about the grand universal theory of grinding. And to do that, I'm going to switch out the burrs in this to the unimodal burrs. I'm not going to film myself changing the burrs because it's really not that interesting, but I will time it and tell you how long it took, so you have an idea of how long it takes to switch burrs out if that's something you're imagining you're going to be doing. Marks, get set. 2 minutes 20. When we grind this coffee, I want you to think about the journey that the bean takes through a grinder. It's a whole bean at the start. As it goes through the auger system, it may be partially broken, some of it may be broken down. And then if you look at a burr, there are obviously different cutting teeth in a burr. And the first teeth they'll encounter are the big chunky ones that are, again, pre-breaking teeth, and then some slightly finer teeth, and then right at the end of the edge of the burr, on its way out, it passes through the finishing kind of teeth, for want of a better word, heads into the burr chamber, will get through a little exit chute out and to where it's going. That's the journey of the coffee bean. What I'm interested in the grand universal theory of grinding, is bottlenecks. Right? At some point, there is a constraint in that system. Most of the time, that's the finishing teeth themselves, right? The coffee can be fed into the finishing teeth faster than it can get out again. And when you have a bottleneck in the grinding system, coffee is unable to escape fast enough and it spends longer being ground than potentially necessary. The more time the coffee beans or the ground spent being sort of reground, the more fines you'll generate, because the more times you're breaking that piece, and every time you sort of cut a piece of coffee, fine particles below, let's say, 90 microns in size, they are created, right? And generally speaking, loads and loads of them don't taste very good, and certainly very large pieces don't taste very good. So we don't want big chunky pieces, we don't want loads of tiny fine pieces. If an auger slowed the feed of beans going into the burrs down, then you may have less bottlenecks. You may have less regrinding because you're feeding the beans in slower. This is the slow auger, now at a relatively coarse setting. I think the burr gap's about 480 microns for a single cup V60. But even with the slow auger, we're probably getting a bottleneck in this grinder. Now, this is not a criticism of this grinder. Every single grinder will have a bottleneck. But coming into this, the auger system made me wonder, can we kind of move the bottleneck around? Variable RPM motors will in some ways change the nature of the bottleneck slightly. I believe this is why you might see a kind of bell curve of quality in an RPM adjustable grinder, because you're sort of changing where the bottleneck is happening or the intensity of that particular bottleneck. At very low RPMs, it may be that you're just not feeding in enough beans to get a bottleneck at the finishing burrs. That may improve the quality. In other grinders at low RPM, the opposite may happen, where you just can't finish enough coffee and it's all jamming in behind it. I think that might be why you don't see a particularly uniform response to variable RPM in different grinders, or even across different burr sets. I don't think we understand this very well, But as I look at a system like this with an auger that you can change and modify, well, it makes me excited about the possibilities of it. Let me brew this and I'll show you a chart. It's a good chart, I promise. To set this up, we need to talk about single bean feeding. Maybe you don't have as much time as me, but it's kind of well known that if you feed beans one at a time into a grinder, your grind distribution is massively changed by this fact. Because when you single bean feed, there are no bottlenecks. The coffee bean pieces can pass through with nothing in the way. What I'll show you is a chart where we took this grinder, the unimodal Burrs, one grind setting, and we ground a normal dose and measure the particle size there, and then single bean fed into that. This is what's called a volume distribution chart. On the right-hand side are coarser pieces. It's not by weight, it's by volume, which is kind of confusing. But you'll see that the single bean feed was much, much coarser overall than the normal feed, right? And that implies that all sorts of pieces are getting reground in a normal dose, right? The big pieces are being cut down into smaller pieces, and so you see this big distribution change. What we can do with our particle size analyzer also is show you a particle size count and show you just of the fines. Now, in any ground coffee, if you go by number, there's just way more fines. There's way more fines. And so you'll see here a really big difference in the peaks. The coffee that was ground as a normal dose has way more small fines. And the single bean feed has a big peak of fines, but it is a coarser peak of fines. It's very confusing. Ultimately, you see a really dramatic difference in the resulting, let's say, espresso. If you grind for espresso, a normal dose, and then single bean feed that grind setting, the resulting shot will just gush out incredibly fast. There's not enough fine pieces to get resistance. It's a totally different thing. My interest with the augers is, can you get closer to single bean feeding by changing the rate that you're feeding pieces in? The twist on this, of course, is pre-breaking, right? Now, we do know if you sort of break coffee into large pieces of bean, not grind it necessarily, but kind of pre-break it, that also produces less fines. It seems to pass through the burrs more easily than sort of whole beans do, and so that's a kind of benefit. We didn't see between the three different augers, and you can only get two of them now, I think, so the fast is not available, but between the fast, the medium, the slow, we didn't really see significant, meaningful differences. I'm always hesitant to ascribe too much to taste in the tastings that we've done, but even looking at particle size distributions. Now, I should say this every time we talk about particle size distributions. The particle size distribution chart that you can produce by measuring the grinds coming out of a grinder is not a universal truth about that particular grinder. It tells you about that coffee ground on that day at that grind setting by that grinder. It doesn't mean the grinder is good or bad or anything else. It's just a single point of data, and you can compare one point to another point, right? But people talk about, oh, if I could just see the grind distribution chart for this grinder, I would know if it was good or not. You really wouldn't. I'm just always hesitant to talk about them as a kind of universal truth. Be skeptical of these charts. But all the way back to this, across 4 different burr sets and 3 different augers, there was not a reliable, consistent impact on taste and grind distribution that came specifically from the auger. What we then did, that was a little bit mean because I had to have some help with this, thanks Sharka. We then took out the burrs and ran some beans through the different augers to see, you know, how different they were in their pre-breaking. And then we took the resulting beans and broken pieces, separated them out, and could see by weight what percentage of coffee was being kind of pre-broken by each of the different augers. Just clean you out. Ooh. Let me show you the resulting sort of outcome of one of the set of augers with no burrs. Now, there were slight differences between the 3 augers. The fast auger broke about 64% of the beans by weight, the medium auger about 59%, and this, the slow auger, it broke about 57.4% of the beans. Not a huge variance there. Right? Not that different, which is interesting. The resulting grind times aren't that different. It feels like, as a sort of critique of the auger system, I think it has a ton of potential, but I would need to see a little bit more variance between them to really, truly get on board with it. I think I want to see slower feeding augers in the future. It could be a slower grind time if I get better results. For something like filter coffee, where really, you know, it's not about resistance the same way that espresso is, less fines might be wonderful. It may not get close to single bean feeding, and that's okay, but it may be better. But let's taste a well-extracted brew on the unimodal burrs. I mean, lovely. At this point, I can't really come along and say these burrs are anything short of very good, The coffee is very good. The brew technique was seemingly adequate. Of course, it's going to be good. Most of the experience of making the coffee is very good, but I do feel like there's potential left in this particular system. Actually, that is good. I'm going to have a bit more. I feel like people think I never enjoy anything on this channel. I have a great time quite a lot of the time, to be honest. I will say, even after all the testing and tasting and all the rest of it we've done here, I'm still kind of a Burrs skeptic to some extent. I see comments on the internet where people will speak in absolutes about how a set of Burrs tastes, especially in comparison to another set on a different grinder and all this kind of stuff. I think it's kind of okay to believe that, because it would probably genuinely make your coffee taste more enjoyable to you if you believe you have the right Burrs for your setup. I think there's kind of a really helpful placebo effect confirmation bias thing going on there that I'm totally okay with. I'm just very hesitant to talk in absolutes about Burrs. I think there are good quality Burrs. I think that AliExpress knockoffs are not particularly good quality Burrs. But besides that, I'm just hesitant to go too far down that particular rabbit hole. So I guess my final sort of critique of this is the Auger system is interesting, but I don't believe it's reached its potential yet, and I don't see that significant of a variance between the different Burrs. I know a bunch of people out there have these grinders with different augers, and so I'd be super interested to hear their feedback and thoughts and comments and experiences in the comments down below, because, you know, what we experience here is one grinder, one setup, one opinion. There are other opinions, and none should be too loud. Let's wrap it up with a few thoughts on who should buy this grinder and how it stacks up maybe against other grinders out there in the market, though this is not going to be an exhaustive list by any stretch. If you're buying this because you've seen it and you want it. You want it because you like how it looks, you like the idea of a great platform for a very common size of very good Burrs. That's appealing to you. To buy one is not easy. You've got to get on a wait list. You've got to pre-order one. So it requires you wanting this thing. If I look at other grinders at similar price points, there's the P64 from Option-O, which I think is also a beautiful, excellent grinder that is an excellent platform for 64mm Burrs. Has variable RPM, whereas this does not have the Auger system that this does. At this point, it's kind of aesthetics and price and all the rest of it. By the time you've stacked up this, it may come to more than the price of the P64, but it may look exactly how you want it to. So again, it's where price gets difficult. If I was solely drinking filter coffee, and so I would need probably one Burrs set, and you look at something like the Ode 2 with the sort of Gen 2 Burrs in it at $300 and something, I think it is, versus this at say $1,500 plus. It's interesting. As a pure filter coffee grinder, one of the things we did is actually take a Burrs set from this and slap it into the Ode and see how different the grinds were. Does the grinder really meaningfully impact the grind distribution? I'll show you the chart. You'll see some outliers in both, but don't worry about those. Ultimately, my opinion is not tastably. I think Burr wins out over grinder in terms of end product, even with something like a Prebreaker here. And, you know, the Ode kind of has a sort of Prebreaker augury thing going on to move the beans down, but it's different. It's not the point. That, you know, is this 5 times better than that? It feels way more premium, there's no doubt there. And there's not really anywhere a kind of linear relationship between price and excellence at a certain point. You get into the hockey stick of price for the incremental gains. And this is across the line of incremental gains. Like you're not getting 5 times the value of an Ode, but it is a better built, nicer feeling, more enjoyable grinder to use, even if the Ode's a little bit less messy and this is a little bit more messy unless you're spraying, but not spraying too much. I like this grinder a lot. I do. I've complained about little things, but ultimately I think it's excellent. There's not really any other way to describe it. It's very well made. It's very enjoyable to use. I like the detail, attention. I enjoy that it's an evolving thing, constantly, you know, being improved and iterated upon. I like the community around this thing that is interested in having the best experience possible and sharing within that own community and talking back to the manufacturer who's engaged. That's charming. It's not entirely unique to Zerno, but it is nice to see in these kind of new manufacturers a different kind of engagement with the audience than we've seen historically from legacy manufacturers. This, of course, goes to Patreon, one of my supporters there, because Patreon allows me to turn up like a regular customer and just buy these at full price with no expectation of anything in return from the manufacturer. I get to say what I want. It's unbiased, and I really appreciate that, and I love giving these away. And there are aspects of this that I genuinely will miss. We have some really lovely grinders here, but I really like the utility of this, the workflow of this. I do like it a lot. I will miss it. It's an excellent grinder. I will be sad to see it go, but I will be happy to see someone else be happy to receive it and have it land on their doorstep. Now, though, I want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on all of this? Do you have thoughts about things like Auger systems? Is it a potential opportunity for grinders as a whole to improve what they're doing and produce less fines and mimic single bean feeding a bit more? Is it a dead end? Would it annoy you too much to double your grind time in exchange for better ground coffee outcomes. No one's going to be there single bean feeding every day, I suspect. It's really, really slow. But could we get a little bit of that automated into our daily lives? That would be nice. Wouldn't it be nice? Anyway, if you've got one of these, share your thoughts, share your feedback, any comments. I'd love to hear how you've been getting on with it, what your experiences are, how are they different from mine. But for now, though, I will say thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.